Hey guys, welcome back to Trekyards. It's time for another exciting adventure with a special guest, and he's joined us before. We have
It's
the
Commander
very
Goggins!
talented. Oh well, yeah, I'm Captain Foley, by the way, just in case you didn't
Am I
know.
the special guest or
And
someone
of
more
course,
special here?
we have someone more special
Oh,
than you, Commander.
that's exciting.
We've got the very talented and extremely cool Thomas Marrone joining us today to talk about some Star Trek Online, which is always cool and fun to do. So we're gonna have some fun today, and hopefully you guys will enjoy it.
Hey everybody.
And today we're looking at a brand new ship, a brand new, new, but in a sort of middle of the timeline era of an older, which is actually a more modern ship. It's an interesting one.
Yeah, so we're gonna look at the Georgiou class starship, which is obviously named after Captain Philippa Georgiou of the USS Chenzhou, seen in Star Trek Discovery. For people who haven't seen it yet, the Georgiou is essentially a motion picture era redesign of the Walker class from Star Trek Discovery. So the Walker class was generally active, 22, probably 40s up through the 50s, maybe even earlier than that. Basically, how this all came about was we were creating a new bundle for Star Trek Online that was going to have ships from Star Trek Discovery in it. And when we do that, when we add ships to the game, we like to create our own spin on them. We obviously have the canon ship for people who are excited about like having I want the thing I saw on the show, but then we also like to create our own version of the ship for Star Trek Online's 25th century so that the game still has its own look and identity. It'd be interesting to do a version of the Walker class that's this tier 4 version, a bonus skin for it that doesn't go all the way up to Star Trek Online era but still is more advanced than what we saw in Discovery. Okay, what era do I want to do if I do that? I mean, and so I kind of thought, well, maybe a TNG Walker would be interesting, but frankly, the Walker already kind of looks like TNG. It's really sleek. The cells are pretty sleek. So I decided to step it back a bit further, and I love the aesthetic of the motion picture. The Constitution refit, the Excelsior, the Oberth, the Constellation, all that stuff. So I thought, man, it would be really cool to take this and reinterpret it through that lens. And so it was kind of a personal project too, where I just used it as an excuse to just add another ship of that era to the game. Originally, my thinking was that it was going to be a refit of the Walker class, but as I started to design it, I really got way far away from that and just decided it was going to be a brand new class that could use those parts.
Yeah, and looking at it, the first thing I thought was immediately Centaur, but I do see a few different design elements here. Obviously it's based on the Shinjo, but like I said, I saw the Centaur. I see a little bit of the Clark class in it as well. Were those any influences? How do you go about redesigning existing design into something a little bit more unique?
And I want to jump in there as well because as soon as this came out and I knew it was your ship, I said, Thomas, I love it. It looks a bit of a kit bash from the outset, and you're like, it's not a kit bash, and it isn't, but it's a wonderful, it feels very, very familiar, and you can point to pieces, but as soon as you get up close, you're like, no, it really isn't, and that's the wonderful type of kit bash, and so we see elements, but really it's its own beast.
Stuart mentioned the Centaur, and that was kind of a big inspiration starting point. Obviously, if you look at the bottom, you'll see it has the Excelsior shuttle bay, which the Centaur has that but on the top. And I did that because it really gives the ship a really great sense of direction. And I wanted to make sure, when you're looking at the bottom that you have a really cool arrowhead shape that's pointing forward. And that was another thing I was taking from the Walker class too, that the bridge on the bottom really adds a really dynamic shape down there. So I wanted to make sure that this had a version of that, although I did move the bridge to the top because I wanted it to feel have the Excelsior bridge cake planted on there to give it a sense of scale, so that you can look at it and see exactly, okay, that's the Excelsior bridge, so I know pretty much exactly how big this thing is. I actually built the Malachowski model for STO as well. So I think that was probably in the back of my head when I was thinking about these struts. And I thought it'd be really cool to have the nacelles pointed straight up and down, and just it makes it feel kind of like it's gliding on air, like it's almost like a kite. And that's kind of where I was going with it. And it just really, when you have those straight parallel lines, that also reinforces the kind of the Art Deco style of that era, right? Between the Enterprise, even though the the Enterprise nacelles are on angled struts, the nacelles themselves are straight up and down, and the Excelsiors are as well. And the Excelsior actually even has struts that are parallel and perpendicular. So that's kind of all that stuff was going through my head as I was doing it. Now I'm not an accomplished concept artist. Like I don't really take a lot of time to draw things out before I go. I generally will design something as I'm modeling it, which isn't very efficient. But when you're starting with a kit bash, kind of like this was, I started with kind of the Walker parts and the Excelsior parts and just started throwing things together and seeing what looked good and what didn't. And even though it looks like an Excelsior saucer, I actually started with a Walker saucer because I wanted to make sure I wasn't shrinking it down too much. By the end of it, might as well have been an entirely new piece because there's a lot of different subtleties in there once you start to get in and really look at it.
Well, I was going to ask, I mean, the whole idea about kit bashing is very much that era's de facto element, even to the shuttles, because they were just literally repurposed shuttles. But what temptation do you have very much just to use the existing parts which have already been built for STO in multiple ship cases, because it is very much a plug and play?
When I looked at the Walker and I started, was like, how do I TMP this, and what are the shapes that would make this feel at home in the 2380s, 2280s, 2290s? It came like I started to see the shapes in my head pretty early, and so I knew like I really wanted to do that really long, thin deflector. And I was like, okay, well that's new. And then I started thinking about the nacelles. I didn't, because of scale. I really hate when you see a ship that has parts that look exactly the same but have just been scaled up or down. That's like one of my pet peeves. The Curry, right, is a good example of that, where the Excelsior through deck carrier, which is a cool idea, and I would like it so much better if it actually had Excelsior nacelles instead of the scaled up Constitution nacelle. So I didn't want to do that. Constitution nacelles would have been too small. Excelsior nacelles, I could have added them, but then it really would have just been a Centaur, right? So I felt like it really needed new nacelles, and that was actually one of the things I'm really happy with how they came out, was the brand new nacelles. I started working with the engine section, and I think I did start with a more traditional Excelsior saucer, but I really wanted to develop it and like kind of see how I could set it apart and make it look, like a cousin of the Excelsior, but not exactly a sister. And as I did that, that also helped me kind of inform the background lore of the ship. That was an exciting thing to work on. I always love to do that when I'm doing the art for ships, is also thinking about the function and the history of the ships as well.
Yeah, one of the things I was going to talk to you about was the nacelles. It looks like you incorporated some of the Oberth style nacelles in there as well with that rear end, which I really appreciate. Those are kind of underappreciated nacelles. So what was the process of going through the nacelle design? I mean, these are fantastic. I absolutely love them.
In general, the Oberth is really an underappreciated ship. It's a really elegant, I think because it's like a small science ship, people don't really give it its due in terms of like how cool it looks. Like it's a really elegant design. And so I was thinking about the Oberth as a place to start, precisely because it is more rare. You don't see a lot of designs that are derived from it. So I did. I started with the Oberth nacelles, and originally these nacelles were rounded in the front like the Oberth was. They always had the back that they had, but then I thought it would be interesting to kind of, what if we take all the machinery and sort of expose it on the inside? Because as I was developing the ship, I sort of came to the conclusion that this was a kind of a competitor to the Excelsior. Which is why you don't see too many of these in the future, or you see none of them. I had to justify, if it's a contemporary of the Excelsior and the Miranda, like why don't we also see a million of these, in TNG and the movies and stuff? And so my justification was that, well, this was a sort of dead end for technology. That this was a like if you're into jet fighters, that there was the F-22 won the contract, but there was also the YF-23, which was an alternate design from a different company that was vying for the same thing. So this ship was meant to be you're going to do this with the Excelsior, but we think this would be a better route to take. And ultimately it didn't get picked, but maybe they still built a few, but those were phased out pretty quickly. But ultimately, I started with the Oberth nacelles. I started thinking about other Art Deco pieces of architecture, actually. And so there was a point where I even had little triangles in the front, kind of like the Chrysler building. which looked kind of cool, but I couldn't really integrate them with the rest of the design. But just having the path around a circle and the repetition going on there, I think really emphasizes the connection to that era.
Yeah, and I do appreciate the exposed Bizarre collectors on like this era of engine because we never see them really. They're hidden on the refit, they're hidden on the Oberth, so that I think is fantastic. So
but since you've mentioned it very clearly, the connection and where it fits in the timeline, obviously it's still a fictional universe, fictional game, and this is still really a skin for a Discovery era ship. But you try to put some thought in. And I did these scale charts showing it very much in congruity with the universe. So I was going to ask originally when it would be timeline wise. It does very much feel like sort of a last gen approach for a new vessel because it is using like Reliant torpedo pod pieces. The Excelsior takes everything and pushes it to next gen. Everything's integrated, everything's sleek, much more internal volume, but in secondary hull rather than the primary hull, which is far more of an NX-01 style, and obviously Walker and Miranda. So it's the more old approach, but I guess using upscale, newer pieces of the same old parts. Whereas Excelsior went the new approach and obviously won out.
I was trying to figure out what this was going to look like when I decided, okay, it's going to be motion picture era. And my original plan was, okay, I'll make a refit of the Walker, right? Because that would be cool. That sounds cool. The problem is the Walker is so big that you can't just give it a Constitution saucer. It just wouldn't, like a Constitution refit saucer, it just wouldn't look right. So that's when I kind of stepped back and I said, well, the Excelsior saucer is almost big enough. And so that's when I started to pivot towards the Excelsior aesthetic, because my original intention was going to be a lot more like a Constitution refit sort of look. And part of that, again, was to stay away from the Centaur a little bit. But just in terms of scale, I knew that having a Constitution saucer wouldn't really, when you did what you did, where you put them all next to each other, it would look really weird to have this giant Constitution saucer that's almost as big or bigger than an Excelsior saucer, right? So that's sort of when I pivoted and started to do a new type of ship. And so I thought about, okay, well, this is going to be a competitor to the Excelsior. And so I thought about it as a competing design philosophy, where the Excelsior is we're going to take everything about the Constitution and like ramp it up, right? It's going to be a multi-mission ship. It'll be very powerful, but it can, have a lot of space to do a lot of different things. And so my thinking for the Georgiou was, well, this is kind of the height of the Cold War between the Federation and the Klingons. And so the Georgiou would be designed to essentially be a D7 killer, or Katinga, match or beat the Katinga class battlecruiser. So in my head, the Georgiou is actually a purpose-built, this is a battlecruiser it's fast, it is a bit more maneuverable than the Excelsior, it has more heavy weapons. Having the giant roll bar on the bottom, that was specifically this is designed to go toe-to-toe with Klingon attack ships. And again, it is an experimental ship, so it is going to have some of the earlier tech on there that, they can't reinvent every wheel, right? So they have new engines on it, but they're going to have the Reliant style torpedo launchers, although it is customized to the Georgiou. It has 4 launchers front and back instead of 2, and it has some really big mega phasers on it and stuff like that. And that was all just part of the lore. The actual stats in the game are very different. And I have another reason that away as well. But
I agree with everything you just said there, but in the context of offense, because defense, because it is missing that secondary hull powerhouse, that you get a sense that has a lot of, the warp core can afford to be big, can afford a lot of deuterium, all that stuff, that it might be strong offensively, and get those punches off to the D7, but in a longer fight, it would feel a lot worse than, say, an Excelsior, which has that more robust shell, very much like in STO with the attack class versus the engineer class.
I think so. I think I built, it has a lot of these power crystals on the top back, and I think they built a lot of redundancy in the systems. I think one of the reasons they wouldn't have put a secondary hull on it is because they were kind of hopeful they could build a lot of these really quickly. So maybe they were trading that extra mass and extra durability to get a lot of these spun up, as they saw well, the Klingons have been building battle cruisers like this for 100 years or whatever. We have a huge gap in our fleet composition. We need to make sure that these are cheap enough that we can get a lot of them into space as quickly as we can. So I think they traded initially some survivability for that.
Those mega phasers, how are you feeling?
I was wondering why they weren't placed at where the strut like comes to a point at the bottom. But now looking at the top view of the Shinzo, I can see you're just trying to tie in that element, like the fins that are on the Shinzo strut. I absolutely love the fact there's mega phasers on it. So yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to give those little doodads a purpose. On the Shenzhou, it's not really clear what they're for. But they had to be there because you can swap parts with the Shenzhou. So you could use the bottom stanchion of the Shenzhou with the Georgiou instead of the torpedo pod. So the extents of that bottom section, it needs some place to go on the Georgiou. So that's sort of why they had to be where they had to be to satisfy the customization options that exist in the game. It's one of those things that's sort of like, it's a constraint, but it can make you do something, make a better design because you have to follow those constraints, which is generally, I think a lot of people agree with, that sometimes not having enough money or having to play within the lines makes for better work when you have these constraints that you have to follow.
So looking at the size chart, it's upscaled the same as the Shinjo. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing necessarily. Would this work better as a smaller ship in universe, do you think, or do you like it the size that it is? Because with those nacelles compared to the Excelsior, it looks a little bit too big. But maybe that's just my eye that's seen that. I'm not sure.
I had to be careful because, again, I had to make sure that if you're mixing parts with the Walker class, that it didn't look ridiculous, if you used like the Walker saucer with the rest of the ship, right? If I had my druthers, I probably would have kept the scale of the Discovery ships consistent with the original series era. Like, even if they changed nothing else about the designs, like just having them fit in line would have made my life a lot easier for a lot of reasons. Because it is a little bit bigger than the saucer's a little bit bigger than the Excelsior, but I don't know. I mean, I just tried to build the lore into it in terms of why, if it's meant to be an alternate to the Excelsior, then it sort of makes sense that at least the saucer would be around the same size, right? If it's meant to sort of hit ton for ton, then like it doesn't have a secondary hull, but that's why the primary hull is a little bit bigger.
Yeah, when you put in the top scale, it stands out a bit, but kind of so does the Ambassador. It is that upscale in a certain element which is a bit off-putting, but it's because it is a very different functional type. You look at just in the saucer element, it's like, oh well, yeah, you're losing all this other stuff. If you remove the nacelles, you'd suddenly say, oh well, okay, the length is suddenly a lot less, and it's not massively thick or anything. It's a bit big, but it's when you're trying to pack so much into the functional area of the saucer, that makes sense. The Shinjo herself is a weirdly, I think, placed ship of how it's a short range sciencey vessel, but it's kind of huge. It doesn't quite. But this one, I think, the way you removed almost internal volume to kind of focus on one zone, I think does work quite well. Although it would have been really fun to have seen, even if you could do in the future, an alternate, just because you're already halfway there, and just do a refit style saucer variant of that ilk, and see kind of like the one step before. The status quo version, because just like the Reliant is very much just this version of the Enterprise refit, seeing this very similar pieces, but very much a direct cousin, and then they took that and ran and said, we're going to do one more. We're going to take this Ferrari one step further and make it the big ship. Would have been kind of cool. Just looking at that compared to the Shinjo on top, it's I like that it's not a refit. The fact that it is so clearly a different space frame. Everything is visually inspired, and so you wouldn't refit incredibly old, incredibly low end ships. So whereas a fresh space frame in an aesthetic we kind of like, I think was a much safer and sensible way to go. And it definitely, that bottom view with the torpedo launchers and all the detailing is really interesting, but so familiar at the same time. So I do want to say well done, because it is.
Thank you.
Reef era is both tricky and wonderful if you can get right. And while it's a little bit odd, just a little bit, it's fun odd. That's
the trick, I think, of making a memorable design. Is there has to be something about it you're like, huh? But no, because otherwise, I mean, I think a lot of science fiction actually falls in this trap where you have some really talented concept artists who make something that's sort of aesthetically perfect, like all the lines meet up in exactly the right places, and then but if you squint, it's just a rectangle. You know, like it's so so something I think to really stand out and be memorable needs a personality, and the way you get personality is by adding a few weird doodads on it, or tweaking it so that it's not quite 100% aesthetically like perfect. You know, it needs to have it needs to look like it was built the way it was built for a reason, and usually that means
designed for function, not for aesthetics. It's designed for a purpose. It should be. That's its fundamental reason for existing.
Well, I gotta say, I really appreciate the uniqueness of it. The fact it could have been so easily just kit bashed together, but the care you took to just make things unique and their own. Even the nacelles, like I said earlier, they almost seem like if you stripped off the shell of an Excelsior class nacelle, that's how they would look internally, and complete with the Bizarre collector.
So there's a shuttle bay in the back that's obviously the Constitution refit shuttle bay. Above that is a kind of landing pad type thing. You guys know how some nuclear submarines, they'll have little like auxiliary subs that they'll use for like rescue and operations and Navy SEAL and stuff. So I thought that would be kind of a cool thing, that maybe the ship was designed, it could support a small ship like that, like a like a larger kind of runabout type ship that would be docked there, permanently or semi-permanently. So this ship is from before the Federation couldn't use cloaking devices, right? So maybe the auxiliary craft can actually cloak and go do covert missions and come back to the Georgiou when they're done. Just some interesting thoughts about that. It makes sense to me that by 2285, 2290, the Federation would at least be able to put cloaking devices on smaller ships.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, Thomas, for joining us and sharing this ship and all your passion for Star Trek with us today. It's always a great pleasure to talk to you. So hopefully the fans out there really enjoyed it as well. I'm sure we'll see that in the comments.
I hope they like it. Thanks so much for having me on.
No problem. Hope to have you on again soon. But until next time, guys, like I said, Thomas will probably be scoping out the comment section. So make sure you write some good comments in there. Ask him some questions maybe. And we look forward to having him on again. But in the meantime, click subscribe, click notify, so that when we do have him on, you'll be able to see it. And do all the classic stuff like share the episode around, check all the links down below, join our social media, and just join the Trekyards community.
Oh, and support on Patreon if you want to support this show and other shows, or one-time donation at trekyards.com, or buy a shirt of a press, or go play Star Trek Online, because that's always fun too,
Yes.
And how can they play the ship, Thomas, if they want to go play it?
So if you want the Georgiou, you can get it it's exclusive to the Discovery Operations bundle, which includes the T4 scaling walker, but also includes a bunch of other really cool ships, including STO's version of the Shepard class, STO's version, which is we call the Gagarin, the Shran, which is a McGee variant, and then the Coog and the Cleon Bird of Prey from Discovery as well. So, and there's a bunch of other stuff in that bundle. So it's a cool set of things inspired by and from Discovery.
All right. So until next time, guys, go have some fun with Star Trek Online, and we will see you later. Bye, everybody.
Live long and prosper.